At its height, it was the largest empire the world had ever seen, 9 million square miles of conquered Earth, stretching from the shores of the Pacific to the plains of Eastern Europe, ruled by a single family born in felt tents on the windswept grasslands of Central Asia. No empire before or since has held as much of the world's land in a single, unbroken grip, and it built itself in less than a single human lifetime. It was gone within 40 years of its peak. Not conquered, not dismantled by some greater power rising to meet it. It simply stopped being one thing and became several smaller warring things, and then those things collapsed too. The question that has haunted historians ever since is not how something so powerful was destroyed. The question is why a system so perfectly designed to win could not survive its own victory. That is the story told here. The Mongolian plateau sits at the heart of the Asian continent, a place so vast and so exposed that the sky above it feels closer than the horizon. Stretching across more than 1 million square miles, it rises into mountains in the north and west, flattens into desert in the south, and in between offers an ocean of grass that ripples in every wind. The altitude is high, the winters are savage, and the summers are brief and merciless. It is not a land that sustains large populations. It is a land that forges the ones it keeps. The climate dictated everything. Temperatures on the steppe swung from 40 degrees below freezing in winter to blazing heat in summer, and the rainfall was too low and too unpredictable for settled agriculture. The land could not be planted. It could not be owned in the way that a field could be owned. What it offered instead was grass, enormous, continuous, wind-stirred grass, and grass-fed horses and sheep and cattle. So the people followed the grass, and their entire civilization was built around the logic of movement. A family's wealth was measured in animals. Horses gave speed, range, and the capacity for war. Sheep gave food, milk, wool, and fell for the round, portable dwellings, jairs, that could be dismantled in an hour and loaded onto carts when it was time to move. Cattle gave labor and additional meat. A man with many animals was a man who could survive a bad winter. A man with none was a man dependent on others, and dependence on the steppe was a form of servitude that left few ways out. Children were on horseback by the age of 3, not as passengers, but as riders, tied in place at first, learning balance before they could reliably walk. By the time a boy was old enough to be considered a young man, he had already spent more hours in the saddle than on his feet. The bow was taught alongside riding, the two skills so intertwined that they were effectively one skill. A Mongol warrior did not ride to battle and then fight. He fought while riding, at full gallop, with an accuracy that armies of settled peoples could barely comprehend when they first encountered it. The steppe's political structure grew directly from its ecology. Because grazing land had to be rotated and water sources were dispersed and seasonal, groups could not cluster in large fixed settlements without exhausting the land around them. This enforced dispersal meant that power could never be fully concentrated. A strong leader could hold a confederation of clans together through personal authority and the promise of shared plunder, but the moment that authority faltered, through death, defeat, or the simple failure of a campaign, the confederation dissolved back into its constituent parts. Loyalty on the steppe was not to a state or a dynasty. It was to a person and to the specific calculation of benefit that person could provide. By the 12th century, the Mongolian plateau was divided among 5 major tribal confederations. The Mongols themselves held territory along the Onon and Kurlan rivers in the northeast. The Tatars controlled the lands near Lake Bir to the east. The Merkits occupied the Selenga basin in the north. The Naimans dominated the Altai Mountains to the west, and the powerful Khanates held the fertile Orkhon Valley at the plateau's center. Each confederation was itself a collection of clans, each clan a collection of families, and each family a universe unto itself, bound to others by a web of obligation, marriage, and mutual suspicion. These confederations were not at peace. They were not even at intermittent peace. They existed in a condition of permanent low-level competition, occasionally flaring into open warfare, punctuated by alliances that lasted only as long as the immediate interest that produced them. Raiding was both economy and politics. Livestock was stolen. Women were taken in marriage by force when they could not be won by negotiation. Feuds passed across generations like inheritance, each act of retaliation creating a new grievance that would outlast the men who committed it. The institution of the Anda, sworn brotherhood between two men, sealed by ritual exchange and oath, was one of the few mechanisms the steppe produced for creating trust across clan lines. Two men who became Anda were bound to each other as if by blood, pledging mutual support in war and peace. It was a powerful bond, capable of bridging the gap between clans that shared no kinship. But it was also a bond between individuals, not between the groups they led. And when the interests of those groups diverged, even the Anda oath could fracture. The steppe generated no institution stronger than the ambitions it also generated. The relationship between the steppe peoples and the settled civilizations to their south had its own ancient rhythm. China was rich, agricultural, and fortified. The steppe was mobile, poor in goods, and rich in military capacity. In years of hardship, drought, harsh winters, livestock die-offs, steppe confederations raided the settled borderlands for grain, silk, and metal. In years of Mongol weakness, Chinese dynasties played rival confederations against each other, subsidizing one to destabilize another, preventing any single power from consolidating enough strength to mount a serious threat. The relationship was not one of civilization against barbarism. It was a structured interdependence, each side dependent on what the other could provide, each side actively working to prevent the other from becoming too strong. The Jin dynasty of northern China, the Jurchen people who had overthrown the Khitan Liao dynasty in the early 12th century, managed the steppe through precisely this policy. They sent payments to favored tribal leaders. They occasionally launched punitive campaigns against confederations that grew too powerful. And they had, within living memory of Temüjin's birth, played a direct role in the destruction of his own family's lineage, working with the Tatars to eliminate the Borjigin clan's most powerful ancestor, a chieftain named Ögedei Khan, who had been delivered to the Jin and executed. The steppe remembered these things. Into this world, every child born to a clan of any standing inherited not just a family, but a set of enemies. Feuds were structural features of steppe society, not aberrations from it. The Borjigin clan into which Temüjin was born carried a blood debt against the Tatars, who had poisoned his grandfather's generation, and a grudge against the Merkits, who considered themselves owed a debt from the generation before that. These were not personal grievances in any simple sense. They were the operating logic of a political system in which violence was the primary currency of power and memory was the primary keeper of account. It is important to understand what the steppe was not. It was not simply a place of chaos waiting to be ordered by a strong man. It had its own sophisticated order, a distributed, flexible, deeply functional system for managing scarce resources across enormous distances. The Kurultai, the great assembly at which chieftains gathered to make collective decisions, was a genuine institution of governance. The seasonal migration routes were carefully negotiated and respected. The oral legal traditions that governed dispute resolution between clans were elaborate and widely understood. What the steppe lacked was not order. What it lacked was the capacity to sustain that order beyond the lifespan of the individual whose authority anchored it. This was the central paradox of steppe civilization before Genghis Khan, and it had produced a pattern that repeated across centuries. A gifted leader would arise, draw clans into confederation through the promise of military success and shared plunder, extend that confederation's reach outward, and then die. The confederation would dissolve. Rival clans would compete for the inheritance. The cycle would begin again. The Xiongnu had done it. The Rouran had done it. The Gokturks had done it. The steppe had a memory of greatness and a structural incapacity to sustain it. Every man who had tried to build an empire on the grasslands had ultimately fed it back to the grass. This was the world Temüjin was born into, not as a curiosity, not as an accident, but as its most extreme and deliberate product. The steppe had been running its cycle of rise and collapse for 6 centuries by the time he arrived. What he would eventually do was not break that cycle through force of personality alone. He would identify the specific mechanisms that produce the cycle and redesign them, one by one, from the inside. The result would be something the steppe had never generated before. Whether it was an improvement on what it replaced is the question this story exists to answer. He was born around 1162 on the banks of the Onan River in the northeast of the Mongolian plateau, to a minor chieftain of the Borjigin clan named Yasugei and a woman named Holon, who had herself been taken from another man in a raid before Temüjin's birth. His father named him Temüjin, meaning roughly finest steel or of iron, after a Tatar warrior Yasugei had defeated in battle. The name carried intention. On the steppe, names were not decorative. They were statements of expectation, and expectations were the first thing a man had to live up to or be destroyed by. When Temüjin was 9 years old, his father took him to the camp of a neighboring tribe to arrange his betrothal to a girl named Borte. It was a practical alliance, the kind that held the steppe together at its seams. Yasugei left his son there as custom required, to live and work among his future wife's people until the marriage was sealed. On his way home, Yasugei stopped to share a meal with a band of Tatars, strangers, but the steppe code of hospitality to travelers was one of its oldest laws. The Tatars recognized him as an enemy. They poisoned his food. By the time Temüjin was summoned home, his father was already dying. What happened next was as swift and instructive as anything the steppe could teach. Yasugei's clan, the Tekiid relatives who had expected to follow a strong leader into battle and plunder, looked at the dead man's 9-year-old son and calculated. The calculation took very little time. They abandoned Holon and her children, Temüjin, his brothers, his sister, and his 2 half-brothers, leaving them on the open steppe with almost nothing. The men who had eaten at Yasugei's fire and sworn him loyalty simply rode away. The clan dissolved back into its constituent interests within days of his death. Temüjin had just received his first lesson in what loyalty meant on the steppe and what it cost when it ended. For the years that followed, the family survived on roots, berries, fish from the river, and whatever small game the boys could hunt. Holon was the organizing intelligence of the household, resourceful, unyielding, the kind of woman who understood that self-pity was a luxury that could get her children killed. She kept them alive through winters that should have finished them. What the family lacked in food and security, they accumulated in something less tangible but more durable, a very precise understanding of how the world actually worked, stripped of the social fictions that comfort people who have never needed to test them. In a dispute over the spoils of a hunting expedition, when Temüjin was perhaps 12, he and his brother Kasar confronted their half-brother Bektar, the eldest male of the family, who had been claiming priority over the limited resources the family hunted to survive. Temüjin ended the dispute permanently. He did not do it in a rage. He did it deliberately, having weighed the consequence and concluded that a rival claim to household leadership in the conditions they were living in was a threat that would eventually cost all of them more than it cost to remove it now. It was a cold calculation. His mother condemned him for it. He accepted her condemnation and continued. The logic of survival on the steppe did not always leave room for sentiment, and Temüjin was learning not to mistake sentiment for morality. Not long after, the Tekiid, the same clan that had abandoned the family to the steppe, sent riders who captured Temüjin and brought him back to their camp as a prisoner. They did not end his life. They placed a wooden kang around his neck, a heavy portable frame that a prisoner wore to prevent escape, and they displayed him at their feasts as a kind of living proof of their own dominance over the family they had discarded. What they had failed to calculate was that Temüjin spent every day of his captivity studying them, their routines, their loyalties, their weaknesses, the specific rhythms of a camp that becomes careless around a prisoner it has stopped taking seriously. He escaped during a festival, hid in a river with only his head above the water while they searched for him, and was sheltered by a family from within the Tekiid's own camp who chose their own conscience over their clan obligations. He filed the name of that family away. He would remember it. He returned to his family. He claimed Borte from her father's household, honoring the arrangement his father had made. The marriage was more than personal. Borte came from the Kongarad tribe, and her family brought connections that Temüjin had no other way to acquire. The steppe ran on kinship networks, and Temüjin, stripped of his own, was building new ones from scratch, one alliance at a time, with whatever material he could find. The sable coat Borte brought as a wedding gift was the first significant asset he had possessed since his father's death. He used it immediately, presenting it to Togrul, the powerful Kharit chieftain who had been his father's sworn brother, as a gesture of tribute and a bid for protection. The gift worked. When the Merkit tribe raided Temüjin's camp and took Borte, avenging, as they understood it, the theft of a Merkit woman by Temüjin's father a generation earlier, Togrul honored the old bond and provided warriors. Temüjin also called on Jamuka, a man who had been his closest companion in childhood, with whom he had exchanged sworn brotherhood in the old Anda tradition. Together, the three forces drove into Merkit territory and recovered Borte. She was returned to Temüjin, already pregnant. The question of who had fathered the child followed the boy Joki for the rest of his life. Temüjin claimed him without hesitation and without public discussion. But the doubt never entirely left the air around Joki's place in the succession, and that unresolved ambiguity would eventually contribute to the fractures that ran through the empire's heart. The rescue of Borte reunited Temüjin with Jamuka, and for a period the two men rode together, shared a camp, and built their combined power across the eastern steppe. The Anda bond between them was real. Neither man invented the warmth of that old friendship, but the steppe did not have a mechanism for two ambitious men to occupy the same space indefinitely. Their followers were watching. Every man who joined one camp instead of the other was a statement about which of them was rising faster. The moment Temüjin's followers began to elect him as their primary leader, the friendship had already become a rivalry. Jamuka understood this with great clarity. So did Temüjin. The difference between them was in how they responded to that understanding. Jamuka was the more aristocratic of the two, a man who believed in the old steppe order, in the inherited authority of noble lineages, in the principle that the right to lead descended through blood. He was brilliant, charismatic, and entirely committed to a world that Temüjin had already decided needed to be dismantled. When Jamuka's younger kinsman was killed in a dispute with one of Temüjin's herders, Jamuka mobilized his forces and attacked. At the Battle of Dalin Baljit, around 1187, he defeated Temüjin decisively. Temüjin retreated, scattered, and almost certainly spent the years that followed in the service of the Jin dynasty across the Chinese border, a period his own later chronicles quietly omitted because it was not a story that served the image of the man he became. He survived it. He learned from it. And he came back. The 2 decades between Dalin Baljit and the Kurultai of 1206 were Temüjin's long education in the precise mechanics of power. He formed alliances with the Jin against the Tatars and was rewarded with an honorific title. He helped Togrul recover his throne from a usurper and deepened the Kharit connection. He crushed the Tatars in 1202, fulfilling the blood debt his father's death had created, and incorporated the surviving Tatar warriors into his own forces rather than allowing them to disperse back into the steppe as a future threat. Each campaign taught him something about the difference between defeating an enemy and eliminating the conditions that would allow that enemy to reform. Togrul eventually turned against him. The Kharit leader's son, Singam, feared that Temüjin's rising power would eventually displace the Kharit at the center of steppe politics, and the fear was well-founded, because it was true. In 1203, Togrul launched a surprise assault. Temüjin was nearly destroyed. He retreated to a place called Baljuna, a small body of water in the southeast, with 19 loyal followers. There, in what became known as the Baljuna Covenant, he and those 19 men drank from the muddy water of the lake together and swore their allegiance to one another regardless of outcome. The men who held to that oath at Baljuna, among the men of different tribes, different religions, different origins, were later elevated to the highest positions in the empire. Temüjin never forgot who stood with him when standing with him offered nothing but the certainty of shared hardship. He returned from Baljuna, defeated Togrul, and then turned to Jamukha, who had spent years assembling rival confederations against him. By 1206, every major opposition had been eliminated. Jamukha's final followers betrayed him to Temüjin, delivering their own leader in a bid for mercy. Temüjin executed the betrayers without hesitation, on the principle that a man who would sell his own leader could not be trusted by anyone who came after. He then met with Jamukha for the last time. The two men who had once been Anda, who had slept under the same blanket as boys, exchanged gifts, sworn brotherhood over shared fires, faced each other across the distance that 20 years of war had placed between them. Jamukha reportedly asked for a death without the drawing of blood, the most honorable form of execution the steppe recognized. Temüjin granted it. He buried his oldest friend and oldest rival with a golden belt he had given him when they were young men, and turned to what came next. In 1206, at a great assembly on the banks of the Onan River, the tribal leaders of the unified Mongolian steppe proclaimed Temüjin Genghis Khan, a title whose meaning remains uncertain but carries within it something close to universal or oceanic ruler. He was approximately 44 years old. He had spent 35 of those years fighting to survive, to recover what had been taken from his family, and to build something that could not be dismantled in the way his father's authority had been dismantled. He had done it without the inherited advantages that the old steppe order reserved for noble bloodlines. He had done it by being better at the game than everyone who played it against him. The political philosophy Temüjin carried into the Kurultai of 1206 was not abstract. It had been hammered out of specific experiences, each one a lesson in what the old system produced and what a different system might prevent. He had watched the clan aristocracy abandon his family the moment his father's authority died. He had watched men of noble birth lead followers into defeat through incompetence that birth protected from consequence. He had watched Jamukha, brilliant, principled, aristocratic Jamukha, lose in the end, because his vision of the steppe was one that the steppe had already demonstrated it could not sustain. Temüjin's meritocracy was not an ideological position. It was a diagnosis. The old system was broken in ways he had personally paid for, and he had spent a lifetime designing its replacement. What he built at the Kurultai was not simply an army or a confederation or even an empire in the conventional sense. It was a new operating system for a civilization, one designed specifically to eliminate the failure modes he had spent his life studying. Hereditary aristocratic titles were abolished. A man's position in the hierarchy was determined by demonstrated ability and unbroken loyalty. Tribal identities were dissolved into the new military structure. The code of law known as the Yasa was established to govern behavior across the entire confederation, applying equally to the powerful and the powerless. It was a radical reorganization of how people on the steppe related to each other and to authority, and it worked with extraordinary efficiency for the specific purpose it was designed for. The question of what it was not designed for would take another generation to fully answer. The Kurultai of 1206 did not simply crown a victor. It inaugurated a system. In the weeks and months that followed his proclamation as Genghis Khan, Temüjin moved with a speed and decisiveness that suggested he had been building the design in his mind for years, possibly decades. He knew precisely what he intended to construct, because he had spent his entire life studying what he intended to replace. The reforms he implemented were not the edicts of a man improvising from a position of sudden power. They were the output of a very specific and long-considered diagnosis. The first and most structurally significant reform was the abolition of the tribal aristocracy as a governing principle. Under the old steppe order, a man's position, in the military hierarchy, in the distribution of resources, in the councils where decisions were made, was determined primarily by the lineage he had been born into. Noble blood conferred authority regardless of competence, and the men who held power through birth alone had no structural incentive to perform. Genghis Khan ended this. Titles inherited from ancestors were stripped of meaning. Position in the new order was determined by demonstrated loyalty and demonstrated ability in that sequence. A man who had served faithfully at Baljuna with nothing to offer, but his presence could rise to command thousands. A man of impeccable noble lineage, who had waited to see which way the wind blew, could expect nothing. The military was reorganized from the ground up on a decimal principle. Every 10 men formed an arban, a squad, under a commander. 10 arbans formed a jaghan of 100, 10 jagans a mingan of 1,000, and 10 minghans a tumun of 10,000. The structure was not merely administrative. It was deliberately designed to sever the connection between military unit and tribal identity. Men from different clans, different tribes, different ethnic backgrounds were assigned to the same arban and expected to fight, eat, and die together. The arban was their primary loyalty group now, not their birth clan. If one man in an arban deserted or failed in battle, all 10 faced consequences together. Collective accountability replaced individual tribal honor as the mechanism of discipline. The effect of this on unit cohesion was extraordinary. A man who had grown up owing loyalty to his clan chieftain, a man who might retreat or surrender based on tribal political calculations that had nothing to do with the battle in front of him, was now bound to 9 specific companions whose survival depended directly on his conduct. The army became a network of small, intensely loyal cells, each cell part of a larger structure that could scale almost without limit. At its height, the Mongol army of Genghis Khan fielded roughly 100,000 men in this configuration, not a mob of tribal warriors following a charismatic leader, but a precision instrument operating under unified command. At the apex of this structure stood the Kashig, the Imperial Guard, an elite force drawn from the sons and brothers of the Empire's most trusted commanders. The standard guardsman of the Kashig outranked a commander of 1,000 ordinary soldiers. This was not symbolic. It meant that the men closest to the Khan were simultaneously hostages, their presence in the imperial household a guarantee of their family's continued loyalty, and the most comprehensively trained warriors in the army. The Kashig numbered 10,000 at its full strength, a tumun unto itself, and it served not only as a military force but as the administrative heart of the empire, rotating through duties that gave its members direct exposure to governance, diplomacy, and logistics at the highest level. The great legal code known as the Yasa governed the new order. It was initially oral, a living body of decree rather than a fixed written text, and its contents were treated as something close to sacred, shown only to those with the right to know them. What is documented of its substance reveals a governing philosophy of remarkable coherence. Loyalty to the Khan above all other obligations. Merit as the sole basis for advancement. Collective punishment for collective failure. Protection of trade routes and merchants. And a religious tolerance that was genuinely radical for the 13th century, not as an expression of personal piety, but as a calculated administrative strategy. An empire that punished people for their beliefs generated resistance. An empire that left beliefs alone and taxed commerce instead generated revenue. The Yasa's religious provisions were more sophisticated than simple tolerance. Clergy of every faith, Buddhist, Christian, Muslim, Shamanist, Taoist, were exempt from taxation and from military conscription. This was not generosity. It was the deliberate cultivation of influential intermediaries in conquered populations, men whose authority over their communities could be redirected into cooperation with Mongol administration without the need to post soldiers in every village. The Khan governed through the social infrastructure he found in place, where that infrastructure was willing to be governed. Where it was not willing, the calculation was different. The economy of the empire was built around a single, brutally honest principle. Conquest was the mechanism of wealth distribution, and wealth distribution was the mechanism of loyalty. Genghis Khan reformed the old steppe tradition of raiding, in which warriors looted for themselves the moment a battle was won, into a centralized system. No looting was permitted until the enemy was completely subdued. All captured goods were then brought under central control, inventoried, and redistributed according to rank and service, down to the widows and orphans of men who had died in the campaign. The Khan's household received 10%. The remainder was shared. A soldier who followed Genghis Khan into battle knew that victory meant reward, that the reward would be distributed fairly by a system he could trust, and that even his death would not leave his family destitute. The system created an army that wanted to fight. This is not a trivial observation. The standing armies of settled civilizations were largely conscript forces, men compelled to serve by feudal obligation or by law, fighting for rulers whose personal interests did not necessarily align with their own. The Mongol army was structured so that the interests of every man within it aligned almost perfectly with the interests of the Khan. Victory paid everyone. Defeat cost everyone. There was no portion of the army that could afford to lose, and no portion that could afford to defect, because defection removed a man from the only distribution system that offered him any material future. The communications infrastructure of the empire was built in parallel with the military structure. The AM, a relay network of horse stations positioned at intervals of roughly 25 to 30 miles across the empire's expanding territory, gave the Khan something no previous steppe ruler had possessed: near real-time awareness of events across vast distances. Riders using the YAM could cover 200 miles in a single day, rotating horses at each station. A message sent from a campaign in Persia could reach the Mongolian heartland in days rather than weeks. The YAM made the empire governable at distances that had previously made governance impossible, and it made the army's coordinated operations across multiple fronts achievable in a way that consistently confounded enemies who assumed that such coordination was logistically impossible. The integration of conquered expertise into the Mongol system was a structural feature, not an accident or mercy. When the Naimans were defeated in 1204, their Uyghur scribes, who possessed a writing system that the Mongols lacked, were immediately absorbed into the imperial administration. The Mongol script was adapted from the Uyghur alphabet on Genghis Khan's direct instruction. Literate administrators from China, Persia, and Central Asia were conscripted into service wherever the army found them. Siege engineers from northern China were attached to the army as permanent technical units, giving a nomadic force the capacity to reduce fortified cities that would previously have required years of attrition or a negotiated surrender. The Mongol army absorbed every technological capability it encountered and added it to its own. Genghis Khan's approach to surrender and resistance was also a deliberate system with a clear internal logic. A city or army that submitted without offering resistance was treated with relative leniency, its people taxed, its commerce protected, its administrators often left in place. A city or army that resisted and was subsequently overcome faced a response calibrated specifically to be heard by the next city down the road. The severity of the response to resistance was not cruelty for its own sake. It was a communication strategy. Each example of the consequences of resistance reduced the probability that the next opponent would choose to resist, which reduced the cost of the next conquest in Mongol lives, Mongol time, and Mongol resources. Terror in Genghis Khan's system was a form of logistics. What had been built by the time the first major external campaigns began was not simply an army. It was a total civilizational machine, a system in which military, economic, administrative, and communicative functions were so tightly integrated that they could not be separated from each other without the whole collapsing. The army was the government. The government was the army. The economy ran on conquest, and conquest ran on the army, and the army ran on the economy. Every component depended on every other component, and the entire assembly depended on continuous motion. The system was designed to expand. It had no stable operating mode that did not involve forward movement. The men who commanded the Mongol forces were among the most capable military minds the medieval world produced, not because Genghis Khan had found them, but because his system had generated them. Subutai, born the son of a blacksmith, rose to become the greatest operational commander the empire possessed, the architect of campaigns that spanned continents and anticipated the movements of enemies a year in advance. Jebe, the archer who had shot Genghis Khan's horse from under him in battle and was rewarded with command for his honesty, led campaigns that covered thousands of miles in months. These men existed because the system selected for competence and rewarded it without reservation. They were the system's argument for itself. And yet the machine contained, from its first operational day, a set of structural tensions that its designers had not resolved and perhaps could not resolve. The empire ran on plunder, and plunder required new territory. The meritocracy generated brilliant commanders, but the succession logic remained entirely dynastic. The Khan's sons would inherit, and the sons of those sons, regardless of their ability. The destruction of the tribal aristocracy had removed one source of fragmentation, but the appanage system, the practice of distributing conquered territory among the Khan's family as personal hereditary domains, had introduced another, slower and more dangerous one in its place. The machine was perfect for what it was built to do. What it was built to do could not last forever. The first targets were chosen with precision. Before Genghis Khan could turn the machine outward, he needed to secure the steppe's borders, to eliminate the tributaries and neighboring kingdoms that might threaten his flank or supply the empire's enemies with resources and encouragement. The Tangut Kingdom of Xixia, a northwest Chinese state that controlled the Hashi Corridor, the critical passage linking China to Central Asia, was the logical first objective. The campaigns began in 1205 and culminated in 1209 in a declaration of submission. Xixia would pay tribute, contribute soldiers, and acknowledge Mongol supremacy. Genghis Khan accepted the terms and moved on. He had not come to settle. He had come to open the road. The Jin dynasty of northern China was a different proposition entirely. The Jurchen people who ruled it commanded a sophisticated bureaucratic state with a large professional army, extensive fortifications, and a long tradition of managing steppe threats through a combination of military force and political manipulation. The Jin had, within living memory, extracted tribute from the Mongols' ancestors and played Mongolian factions against each other for generations. They expected Genghis Khan to behave as his predecessors had behaved, to raid the border regions, accept payments, and recede. When the new Jin emperor sent envoys to demand the customary submission from the new Khan of the Mongols, Genghis Khan's response was not a negotiation. It was an invasion. The Mongol army crossed the Great Wall in 1211. What followed was not a siege in the conventional sense. The army was not designed to sit in front of walls and wait. It was designed to destroy the field forces that defended those walls, to strip an enemy of its capacity to resist before the walls became relevant, and to move so fast that the enemy's command structure could not adapt to what was happening before it had already happened. At Yihuling, a mountain pass near the Jin heartland, the Mongol forces met a massive Jin army and broke it through a combination of tactical deception and concentrated firepower. The Jin general had positioned his forces to hold the pass. The Mongols made him regret having gathered them in one place. The capture of Zhongdu, the Jin capital, the city that would eventually become Beijing, fell in 1215 after a sustained campaign that demonstrated something important about how the machine had evolved. The Mongols who crossed the Great Wall in 1211 had limited experience with siege warfare against heavily fortified urban centers. The Mongols who took Zhongdu 4 years later had recruited Chinese engineers, acquired catapult technology, and integrated the technical knowledge of Jin defectors into their operational capacity. The army that emerged from the Jin campaign was measurably more capable than the army that had entered it. Genghis Khan designed his forces to learn from every enemy they encountered. While the Jin campaign continued under the command of his general Makali, Genghis Khan turned west. The immediate cause was a commercial and diplomatic incident that carried consequences wildly disproportionate to its surface appearance. In 1218, a Mongol trade caravan reached the city of Otrar on the eastern frontier of the Khwarezm Empire, a prosperous Islamic state that controlled much of Central Asia and whose ruler, Shah ad-Din Muhammad, governed one of the most powerful polities between the Caspian Sea and the Hindu Kush. The governor of Otrar accused the merchants of espionage and had them killed. Genghis Khan sent ambassadors to the Shah demanding redress. The Shah had the ambassadors killed. This was a miscalculation of historic proportions. The Khwarezm Empire in 1219 was prosperous, large, and defended by an army of several 100,000 men. It had every material reason to feel secure. What it lacked was a coherent strategy for fighting an enemy that did not behave like any enemy it had previously encountered. The Shah's defensive response, dispersing his forces among the great walled cities of his empire, trusting the fortifications to absorb the Mongol assault, was the response of a commander who believed that territory and walls were the primary currency of military power. The Mongols had a different accounting system entirely. Genghis Khan attacked with a force of more than 200,000 men, divided into multiple columns that struck simultaneously across a front hundreds of miles wide. The dispersal of the Shah's forces, intended as a defensive measure, became a catastrophic vulnerability. No single concentration of Khwarezmian troops was large enough to meet the Mongols in the field. The great cities of the empire, Bokhara, Samarkand, Urgench, Merv, fell one by one, each isolated, each unable to relieve the others, each learning too late that the walls that had protected them from every previous enemy were inadequate against an army that could manufacture the tools to breach them and that possessed the logistical capacity to wait out any garrison that chose to resist. Bokhara fell in 1220. The city's garrison rode out to fight and was destroyed in the field. The civilian population that remained was organized into labor details, the skilled workers, artisans, engineers, administrators, separated from the rest and prepared for absorption into the empire. Those who had offered no resistance were treated with a severity calibrated not to punish them personally, but to communicate a specific message to every city in the region that had not yet decided whether to fight or submit. The message was not cruelty. It was arithmetic. The cost of resistance, delivered in terms that every subsequent city could calculate for itself. The Shah himself became a fugitive, stripped of his army, stripped of his cities, stripped of any organized force capable of challenging the Mongols in the field. Ala ad-Din Muhammad fled westward with Mongol cavalry in relentless pursuit. Genghis Khan assigned his two finest operational commanders to the chase, Subutai and Jebe, with orders to follow the Shah to the ends of the known world if necessary. They very nearly did. The Shah's flight took him across Persia and to the Caspian Sea, where he died of illness on a small island, in a fisherman's shack, wearing a torn shirt. The man who had ruled one of the greatest empires in the Islamic world ended his life with nothing because the system that had destroyed him had been specifically optimized for exactly this kind of outcome. Subutai and Jebe did not return directly after the Shah's death. With Genghis Khan's permission, they continued westward, a force of roughly 20,000 men on what became one of the most extraordinary reconnaissance operations in military history. They swept through the Caucasus, defeated the Georgian kingdom twice, crossed the mountains into the Pontic steppe, and encountered the Cuman Confederation, whose survivors appealed for help from the princes of Kievan Rus. A combined Rus and Cuman force of perhaps 80,000 men rode out to meet a Mongol army a quarter of their size. The Mongols retreated before them for 9 days, drawing the pursuit deeper and deeper across the steppe, stretching the Allied formation, exhausting the horses, eroding the discipline of an army that believed it was winning. Then they turned. At the Kalkar River in 1223, the Rus-Cuman force was effectively destroyed. Subutai noted what he had learned about European armies and returned east. He would use the knowledge 15 years later. The feigned retreat that broke the Rus army at the Kalkar River was not a desperate improvisation. It was a standard operating procedure, one of the most reliable items in the Mongol tactical repertoire, executed dozens of times on as many different enemies. Its effectiveness depended on a specific quality that Genghis Khan had engineered into his army at the level of unit identity, the absolute confidence of every rider and every other rider within their unit. A feigned retreat requires that every man in the fleeing formation trusts that the men around him are retreating by design, not by fear. That trust, maintained under arrow fire in the chaos of apparent defeat, was the direct product of the Arban system, the years of joint training, the collective accountability that bound 10 men together more tightly than any tribal bond had previously managed. The Xia, whose submission in 1209 had opened the road for the Jin campaign, eventually refused to contribute soldiers to the Khwarezm invasion, citing exhaustion. Genghis Khan registered the refusal and did not act on it immediately. He returned from Central Asia, consolidated the gains, allowed a brief respite, and then in 1226 launched his final campaign against Xia. The kingdom that had been the first to submit was the last to be punished for breaking its submission. The deliberateness of the timing years after the refusal, at a moment of Mongol choosing rather than Tangut choosing, was itself a message to every vassal state watching from the margins of the empire. The accounting would always be settled, and the Khan would choose when. Genghis Khan died in 1227 during the Xia campaign. The cause is uncertain. Illness or injuries from a fall from a horse during a hunt, or both together in a body that had been at war for more than 4 decades. He died in the field, which was the only place he had ever truly lived. His burial site was hidden by design. The riders who accompany the body are said to have killed everyone they encountered on the route, so that no living person could report what they had seen. The tomb has never been found. He left instructions that his third son, Ögedei, should succeed him, and that the empire should continue. Both happened. The scope of what the campaigns had achieved by the time of Genghis Khan's death in 1227 was almost incomprehensible to contemporaries and remains difficult to absorb even now. In 21 years of major campaigning, a force that never exceeded a few 100,000 men had conquered territory that stretched from the Pacific coast of China to the Caspian Sea, an area roughly twice the size of the Roman Empire at its height. They had done it against enemies who consistently outnumbered them, against fortifications that had withstood centuries of assault, against armies equipped with superior numbers and in many cases superior technology. The machine had worked precisely as designed. Every campaign tells the same structural story, if you know what to look for. The Mongols did not win through numbers. They won through information, the AM network, the reconnaissance operations, the intelligence gathered from every caravan and prisoner. They won through coordination, multiple columns operating simultaneously across fronts that no single enemy could cover. They won through adaptability, absorbing siege engineers from China, catapult operators from Central Asia, naval expertise wherever the campaigns required it. And they won through the calculated management of their own reputation, which was itself a weapon as real as any bow or catapult. Fear in a Mongol campaign was not a side effect. It was a strategic asset, deployed with the same deliberateness as cavalry. What the campaigns did not produce, what they structurally could not produce, was the administrative infrastructure needed to govern what they had taken. The army passed through conquered territory like a tide, and what remained behind it was tribute collection, occasional garrisons, and the social structures of the defeated people, largely left in place because the Mongols had no apparatus of their own to substitute. The machine was exceptional at acquiring territory. It had almost no capacity for converting that territory into a stable, self-sustaining polity. At Genghis Khan's death, the largest empire ever assembled was held together primarily by the personal authority of the man who had built it, and that man was gone. An empire built on movement had no natural mechanism for the one thing that eventually confronts every empire: the question of what happens next. Genghis Khan had spent his life solving the problems that destroyed other men's power. He had abolished tribal aristocracy, replaced blood loyalty with earned loyalty, and built a military machine that had no precedent in human history. What he had not solved, what the internal logic of his system made extremely difficult to solve, was succession. Not merely the question of who would rule after him, but the deeper structural question of how an empire organized around a single supreme authority could transfer that authority without fracturing everything the authority had held together. The appanage system was the instrument through which Genghis Khan distributed conquered territory among his family. It was simultaneously the empire's greatest administrative convenience and its most dangerous long-term liability. Under the appanage arrangement, each of the Khan's sons received a ulus, a domain comprising specific territory, a designated population, a portion of the army, and rights to a share of the revenues generated by the sedentary lands attached to that domain. The arrangement was logical within the framework of steppe tradition, which held that a father's estate should be divided among his sons. It was also, as a governing principle for the largest empire in history, a time-delayed mechanism of fragmentation. The four sons of Borte, Joki, Chagatai, Ögedei, and Tayui each received their portion. Joki, the eldest, was assigned the westernmost lands, the vast steppe territory that extended toward Eastern Europe, with the instruction that his domain would expand as far as Mongol horses could ride. Chagatai received the lands of Central Asia, the former Karakaitai territories in Transoxania, the great agricultural and commercial corridor between the Amu Darya and the Sir Darya. Ögedei received Western Mongolia and the regions of Tarbagetai. Tayui, as the youngest son, received by Mongol custom the father's original homeland, the Mongolian heartland itself, the place where the empire had been born. And the great Khanship, the supreme authority over the whole, was to pass to Ögedei, Genghis Khan's designated successor. The system created a structural problem from the first day it operated. Every appanage prince was simultaneously a sworn officer of the Great Khan and the autonomous ruler of a domain whose interests would, over time, diverge from the interests of the center. While the empire was expanding, and the campaigns were generating shared plunder that benefited every branch of the family, the centrifugal forces of the appanage system were held in check by the common interest in common victory. The moment expansion slowed, the revenues of each domain became a zero-sum competition rather than a shared dividend, and the loyalty of appanage princes to the Great Khan became a calculation rather than a given. The question of Joki's parentage was the empire's first unresolved succession wound, and Genghis Khan's handling of it, or failure to handle it, left a scar that never fully healed. Borte had been held by the Merkits for 8 months before her rescue, and Joki was born shortly after. The timing made certainty impossible. Genghis Khan claimed Joki as his son without qualification and treated him accordingly. But Chagatai, his second son, refused to accept this. At a formal Kurultai in 1222, Chagatai raised the question publicly, calling his elder brother the son of the Merkits. Genghis Khan publicly reaffirmed Joki's legitimacy. The statement settled nothing. Chagatai's contempt for his brother persisted, the two men's rivalry poisoned every campaign they shared, and the question of Joki's place in the succession remained a live tension that structured family politics for generations after both men were dead. Joki died in 1227, probably a few months before his father, though the exact sequence is uncertain, and the ambiguity of his death compounded the ambiguity of his birth. Some accounts suggest illness. Others suggest the estrangement between father and son had reached the point where Genghis Khan had dispatched his other sons to bring Joki to account by force before news arrived that Joki was already gone. Whatever the truth, Joki's domain passed to his son Batu, who had inherited not only the westernmost territories of the empire, but also the specific grievance of a lineage that had been publicly questioned and never fully rehabilitated. The golden horde that eventually emerged from Joki Zulus carried that grievance into every negotiation with the center for the next several decades. The economy of the empire was built on a model that could not sustain itself in peace. Conquest generated the plunder that paid the army, rewarded the commanders, funded the Khan's household, and distributed shares down to the widows and orphans of the fallen. The system was extraordinarily generous and extraordinarily effective at producing loyalty, as long as there was something to conquer. When the army stopped moving, the revenue stream that the entire distribution system depended on stopped flowing. The empire had no developed taxation infrastructure for its settled populations at Genghis Khan's death, no bureaucratic apparatus capable of converting agricultural and commercial productivity into stable state revenue, and no administrative class of its own, only the borrowed administrators of conquered peoples, whose loyalty to their new masters was conditional at best. The Mongols made no initial use of the existing state machinery they found in conquered territories. The administrative systems of the Jin dynasty, the Khwarezm Empire, and the various Central Asian polities were disregarded in the early period of conquest. Groups of settled population became the personal property of Mongol military leaders, exploited according to whatever calculation those leaders found convenient. There was no unified monetary system. There was no standardized taxation. There was no central authority capable of directing the surplus of conquered territories toward the common maintenance of the empire. Each domain was an island, extracting what it could and competing with the other islands for a share of the center's diminishing attention and resources. Genghis Khan understood that this could not continue indefinitely. In the final years of his life, he made appointments intended to address it, placing Mahmud Yalovak, a Khwarezmian merchant of demonstrated administrative competence, in charge of taxation in the sedentary territories of Central Asia, deploying Uyghur and Chinese administrators in regions where their knowledge of settled governance was indispensable. These were improvisations, not a system. They reflected the Khan's awareness of the problem without constituting a solution to it. The machine had been designed for conquest, and the Khan who built it had spent every year of his reign in the field, where the machine's design was never exposed to the conditions that would eventually destroy it. The Kurultai, the great assembly through which the Khan was elected and major decisions were confirmed, was the one institutional check on the absolute power of the great Khan, and it was also, in the context of the appanage system, a mechanism for managing competition between branches of the royal family. Every succession required a Kurultai. Every Kurultai required the presence and agreement of the appanage princes. This meant that every transition of power was simultaneously a negotiation between semi-autonomous rulers whose interests in the outcome were direct and personal, and whose capacity to make that outcome difficult was considerable. The Kurultai had been designed in Genghis Khan's mind as a mechanism of collective legitimacy. It functioned instead as an arena for dynastic competition. The empire also lacked what every large, settled polity requires to sustain itself across generations: a trained, professional administrative class with institutional memory, standardized procedures, and loyalty to the state rather than to specific individuals. The Mongols had no such class. What they had was a military aristocracy whose members understood war with extraordinary sophistication and governance with almost none. When Genghis Khan appointed a commander to administer a conquered province, he was appointing a man whose entire training, value system, and identity were organized around mobile warfare. The man would extract what he could, maintain order through the implied threat of force, and understand his role as temporary, a holding position until the empire decided what permanent arrangement to make. Permanent arrangements required bureaucracy. The empire did not have one. The pastoral economy of the Mongol heartland was itself a constraint on the empire's capacity to sustain centralized authority. Nomadic life required seasonal movement, the same movement that had made the steppe's political structures unstable for centuries before Genghis Khan's birth. The Great Khan's household was not a fixed court in a fixed capital. It moved with the seasons, as Mongol households always had. The administrative center of the empire moved with it. This made governance of distant territories a permanent challenge, dependent on the Yam relay network for communication and on the personal loyalty of commanders who spent months or years in provinces the Khan could not visit. Personal loyalty to a dead Khan did not automatically transfer to a living successor whose claim to authority was itself disputed. Genghis Khan's decision to designate Ögedei as his successor rather than follow strict primogeniture, which would have named Joki, and then after Joki's death his eldest son, was a deliberate attempt to choose the most capable among his sons rather than simply the oldest. Ögedei was even-tempered, genuinely gifted at managing the competing interests of the family's branches and broadly acceptable to all parties. He was the right choice. But the act of choosing, bypassing Joki's line, bypassing Chagatais' seniority, installing Ögedei over the objections of those who had different preferences, established a precedent that every subsequent succession would repeat. The Great Khan chose his successor. The appanage princes accepted or contested the choice. The Kurultai confirmed or delayed it. And in the gaps between each of those steps, the empire was ungoverned, and the machine that required continuous motion simply sat still. What Genghis Khan had actually built, stripped of its military brilliance and its administrative ingenuity, was a family business operating at continental scale. The empire's unity was the unity of a single extraordinary family's shared interests, expressed through institutions that could channel those interests as long as the interests aligned. The moment the family fractured, which the appanage system made structurally inevitable, and which Joki's ambiguous parentage had already begun, the institutions had no independent authority to hold the empire together. There was no state. There was no bureaucracy. There was no loyal administrative class. There was the Chinggisid lineage, and there was the army, and there was the territory that the army had taken. All three depended on each other, and none of them could sustain the others without the one ingredient the system had no way to guarantee across generations: a great Khan. Genghis Khan died knowing this. The record suggests he spent the final years of his life attempting, in the time he had, to put in place the arrangements that might delay the fracturing he could see coming. He designated Ögedei. He confirmed Joki's legitimacy one last time. He instructed his sons, in language preserved in the secret history of the Mongols, to hold together, to remember that individual twigs break easily, but a bundle cannot be broken at all. His sons listened respectfully and nodded. Then they buried him, sealed the tomb, and began the calculations that would determine which branch of the family would control the most powerful military machine in the world. The bundle was already beginning to come apart. The 2 years between Genghis Khan's death in 1227 and the election of his designated successor were a test the empire had no precedent for passing. Temüjin, the youngest son, held a regency, governing by the authority of his father's instructions while the Kurultai was assembled. The appanage princes gathered from their distant domains, and the Chinggisid family conducted the negotiations that would determine who held the world's most consequential office. The machine sat still for 2 years. It did not collapse, which was itself remarkable. But the stillness exposed something important. The empire's administration was so thin, and its institutional skeleton so sparse, that even the routine functions of governance were strained by the absence of a supreme authority to anchor them. Ögedei Khan was confirmed as Great Khan in 1229 at a Kurultai on the banks of the Kurlan River. He was his father's deliberate choice, even-tempered where his brothers were volatile, genuinely gifted at holding competing interests in balance, possessed of a quality that the steppe had never much valued and that the empire now desperately needed: the instinct for administration. He was not a military genius in the way that Subutai or Jebe had been. He understood his own limitations well enough to know when to delegate command to men who were. What Ögedei brought to the khanship was something rarer in that context: the capacity to govern. His first act of substance was to complete what his father had left unfinished. The Jin dynasty of northern China, reduced to a buffer state south of the Yellow River since Zhongdu's fall in 1215, had survived the 2-year interregnum without a Mongol force powerful enough to end it. Ögedei launched the final campaign in 1231, personally leading part of the army, while his brother Temüjin took another column. The Jin capital of Kaifeng fell after a long siege in 1233. The last Jin emperor, surrounded and without hope of relief, took his own life. The dynasty that the Mongols had inherited as an enemy from Genghis Khan's grandfather's generation ceased to exist in 1234. The blood debt finally was settled. At the same time, Ögedei was attempting something that no Mongol ruler had previously attempted in any sustained way. He was trying to convert a war machine into a state. The instrument he chose was Yelu Chukai, a Khitan administrator of formidable intelligence who had been captured during the Jin campaign and absorbed into the Mongol administration. Yelu Chukai argued, with a directness that few men would have risked with a Mongol Khan, that the empire would generate more wealth from taxing a living population than from stripping a dead one. Ögedei listened. He appointed Yelu Chukai to administer northern China, established a census for tax purposes, instituted standardized levies in silk and silver, and began to construct the bureaucratic scaffolding that the empire's existing administrative apparatus lacked entirely. For the first time, the machine was attempting to run a peacetime program. Ögedei built Karakorum. The decision to construct a fixed imperial capital on the Mongolian steppe, a permanent city, with palaces, administrative buildings, commercial district, and houses of worship for Buddhists, Muslims, Christians, and followers of local traditions, was a statement about what kind of empire this was becoming. Karakorum was modest by the standards of the great cities the Mongols had destroyed. Visitors from China and Persia remarked, not always charitably, on its relative smallness. But its existence was itself the message. A nomadic empire was putting down a root. It was planting a fixed point around which governance could organize itself, through which diplomats and merchants and administrators could pass, and from which the great Khan could govern without being in the saddle. Whether that root could hold against the centrifugal forces already pulling the empire outward was a question Ögedei did not live long enough to answer. The expansion continued simultaneously with the administrative experiments. In 1231, Ögedei sent forces into Korea, which was subjugated over a series of brutal campaigns that the Korean court attempted to survive by retreating to the island of Ganghwa and conducting a nominal submission while continuing to resist from behind the sea. In Central Asia and Persia, Mongol forces pushed further into the Islamic world. In 1235, Ögedei launched the Great Western Campaign that will become the most dramatic demonstration of the machine's reach, a multi-pronged invasion of the Eurasian steppe, Russia, and ultimately Central Europe, commanded on paper by his nephew Bata Khan and in practice by Subutai, the most accomplished operational mind the Mongol military had ever produced. Subutai had been filing away his knowledge of Europe for 15 years, since the reconnaissance of 1223. He had spent those years studying the political fragmentation of the Rus principalities, the tensions between European kingdoms, the tactical limitations of heavily armored cavalry against mobile horse archers. When the campaign finally moved in 1237, it moved with the systematic intelligence of a commander who had been planning it since before many of its participants were old enough to fight. The Rus principalities fell one by one, Vladimir in 1237, Kiev in 1240, each isolated, each unable to coordinate a defense because the political structure that might have coordinated them did not exist. Kievan Rus ceased to be a political entity. In 1241, Subutai executed the operation he had been building toward, a coordinated invasion of Central Europe on multiple axes simultaneously. A northern force struck into Poland, shattering the army of Prince Henry II the Pious at the Battle of Legnica on the 9th of April. 2 days later, the main force under Batu and Subutai annihilated the Hungarian royal army at the Battle of Mohi, King Bela IV barely escaping with his life into Croatia. The Mongols burned Pest, crossed the frozen Danube in the winter, and stood on the plains of Austria. The Holy Roman Emperor was assembling forces. Western Europe was, for the first time, genuinely at risk of the fate that had befallen every other civilization the machine had encountered. And then the army stopped. Not because of European resistance, not because Subutai had run out of ideas or the army had run out of capacity. The army stopped because news arrived from the east that Ögedei Khan had died on the 11th of December 1241, and every prince of Genghis Khan's blood was required by Mongol law and custom to return to the Kurultai and participate in the election of a new great Khan. Bata Khan, the nominal commander of the Western campaign and the most powerful figure in the Jochid line, had personal and urgent reasons to be present at that election. He turned east. Subutai turned east with him. The machine, for the second time in 15 years, simply stopped in place. Europe, which had no knowledge of what was happening in Mongolia, experienced this as a miracle, a divine intervention that had turned the scourge of God away from the gates of Christendom at the last possible moment. Pope Innocent IV called a council. European kings wrote letters of gratitude. The chroniclers searched their theology for an explanation adequate to what appeared to be an act of providential rescue. The actual explanation was a drinking bout in Karakorum that had destroyed the liver of a 55-year-old man. Ögedei Khan had been a heavy drinker his entire adult life. His father had reportedly begged him to reduce his consumption, and Ögedei had agreed and then, characteristically, simply drunk from a larger cup. His death was the logical conclusion of a personal habit, and it changed the history of a continent. Ögedei's administrative legacy was real but incomplete. He had demonstrated that the empire could generate stable revenue from a sedentary population if it chose to govern rather than simply extract. Yellow Chucai's administration of northern China had produced something genuinely new, a functioning bureaucratic layer between the Mongol military command and the Chinese population, capable of collecting taxes, adjudicating disputes, and maintaining the basic conditions under which productive economic activity could continue. The experiment worked within its limits. Its limits were considerable. It applied to a fraction of the empire, it depended entirely on Ögedei's personal support, and it had generated significant resistance from other Mongol commanders and princes who saw systematic taxation as an infringement on their right to extract what they pleased from the populations they controlled. The tension between Ögedei's administrative impulse and the extractive instincts of the appanage system was the defining unresolved conflict of his reign. Every attempt to standardize taxation and protect productive populations ran into the objection from commanders, from princes, from the institutional logic of the war economy itself, that the Mongols had not conquered these territories in order to govern them carefully. They had conquered them to take what was in them. Yellow Chucai argued for the long view. The men around him argued for the immediate view. After Ögedei's death, Yellow Chucai's influence evaporated. His reforms were partially reversed, and the empire reverted toward extraction. The experiment had lasted as long as the man who had sponsored it. What Ögedei had built, stripped of the individual elements that depended on his specific personality, was a demonstration rather than a system. He had shown that the empire could be administered at continental scale if the Great Khan chose to prioritize administration and was capable of enforcing that priority against the appanage princes. He had not built the institutions that would have made that priority self-sustaining after his death. The bureaucracy was real but fragile. The census was real but unenforced in large portions of the empire. The capital was real, but its authority over distant domains was the authority of the Khan's personal will, not of any institutional structure that would survive a succession crisis. And now there was a succession crisis. Ögedei had been the right man for the transition from Genghis Khan's empire to something that might have outlasted it. He had been even-tempered and pragmatic where the situation demanded both. He had been willing to listen to administrators and innovators and foreigners with better ideas. He had understood, at least partially, that an empire that only knew how to take could not last. His death at 55, at the precise moment that Subutai stood within range of the Atlantic coast, was one of the great accidents of medieval history, the point at which a single man's survival or death determined whether European civilization as it existed would persist or be reorganized by the same machine that had reorganized China, Persia, and Central Asia. That he died when he did, of what he died of, is perhaps the most consequential drinking story in the history of the world. Ögedei Khan had been the empire's best argument against itself, the proof that the machine could be governed by a man patient enough to try. His death on the 11th of December 1241 removed that argument, and what remained was the machine running on the logic it had been built with, which was the logic of competition. The appanage princes did not mourn their uncle and then cooperate to select his successor. They mourned their uncle and then began calculating. The calculation was the same one Genghis Khan had watched play out on the steppe his entire life, now operating at continental scale. Who would control the most powerful military force in the world, and what was the most effective way to ensure it was you? Ögedei's widow, Temüjin Khatun, assumed the regency. She was a woman of considerable political intelligence, and she used the regency not to govern the empire in the neutral sense but to position her son Gayuk as the only acceptable successor. The Kurultai that should have convened immediately to elect a new Great Khan was delayed for 5 years, partly because the princes of the blood were scattered across a continent, partly because several of them had no intention of attending an assembly whose outcome had been predetermined by a regent they neither trusted nor respected, and partly because Batu Khan, the most powerful figure in the Jochid line and the nominal commander of the Western campaign, refused to come east. Batu and Gayuk despised each other with a personal intensity that had been building since a drunken confrontation during the European campaign years earlier. A Kurultai that produced Gayuk as Great Khan was not a Kurultai Batu recognized as legitimate. He said as much from his new capital at Sarai on the Volga and declined to move. The stalemate held for 5 years. During those 5 years, the empire was governed, where it was governed at all by regents, local commanders, and the administrative systems that Ögedei had begun to build and that now operated without his personal authority to enforce them. The Western campaign was permanently halted. The European kingdoms that the Mongols had been preparing to absorb had 5 years to rebuild their defenses, construct new fortifications, and reconsider their political arrangements. Europe did not know it had been spared by a political deadlock in Central Asia. It attributed its survival to its own virtues, built new castles, and moved on. Meanwhile, the empire's eastern and central campaigns also lost momentum, suspended in the political uncertainty of a succession that the system had no mechanism to resolve quickly. Genghis Khan was finally elected at a Kurultai in 1246, with Batur represented by a proxy rather than in person, a gesture of nominal compliance that carried no real submission. The Franciscan friar Giovanni de Pian del Carpine attended the enthronement as a papal envoy and left a detailed account of the ceremony. The tent resting on pillars covered with gold plates, the 500 carts laden with tribute from across the empire, the distribution of goods among the assembled princes and commanders. The pageant of Mongol imperial power was intact. The unity it was meant to represent was a different matter. Gaiuk was not his father. He was volatile, resentful of Batur, and physically weakened by the same appetite for drink that had killed Ögedei. He ruled for less than 2 years before dying in 1248, almost certainly of alcohol-related causes, on a military march westward that had every appearance of being a campaign to force Batur's submission by force. Another regency, another deadlock, another interregnum in which the machine sat waiting. The second regency was held by Gaiuk's widow Ogle Kamish, who lacked Temüjin's political skill and found herself unable to control the competing factions long enough to secure the throne for the Ögedei line. What she faced was not merely a succession dispute in the conventional sense. It was a constitutional crisis about which branch of Genghis Khan's family had the right to hold the great khanship at all. The Ögedeids argued that Ögedei had been Genghis Khan's designated heir and that the succession should flow through his line. The Temüjids, the descendants of Genghis Khan's youngest son Temüjin, who included Monk, Kublai, Hulagu, and Erik Bok, argued that the Kurultai had the right to choose the best candidate regardless of which branch he came from, and that several decades of Ögedei incompetence had demonstrated that the best candidate did not come from that branch. Batur Khan, whose Jochid line had been excluded from succession by Chagatais' old challenge to Jochi's legitimacy, decided to back the Temüjids as the better instrument for limiting Ögedei power. Monk Khan, Temüjin's eldest son, was elected Great Khan in 1251 with Batur's decisive support. The election was contested. The Ögedei and Chagatai princes who had gathered at an alternative assembly refused to recognize it. Monk responded with a purge of extraordinary scope. Members of both the Ögedei and Chagatai families were investigated for conspiracy, stripped of their territories, and in many cases removed from power entirely. The purge was effective in the short term. It eliminated the organized opposition, consolidated Temüjid authority, and gave Monk the freedom to govern the empire without constant challenges from rival branches. It also generated a reservoir of grievance in the dispossessed families that would surface again the moment the next vacancy appeared. Monk Khan was, in the narrow administrative sense, the most capable of Genghis Khan's successors after Ögedei. He reimposed financial discipline on the empire, forbidding the unauthorized extraction of resources from civilian populations, standardizing weights and measures, conducting a census, establishing a Department of Monetary Affairs to control the overissue of paper currency that had become a problem under Ögedei's later years. He dispatched his brothers on the two greatest campaigns of the empire's final expansion, Hulagu westward into the Islamic world, Kublai southward against the Song dynasty of southern China. For 8 years, the empire was governed with a coherence it had not known since Ögedei, and the campaigns moved again with the speed that the machine had been designed to achieve. Monk Khan died in 1259 at the siege of a Chinese fortification called Diaoyu Castle. The fortress was never taken, and the great Khan died of dysentery before it could be reduced. He had named no successor with any certainty. What followed was the moment the appanage system had been building towards since 1206. Two brothers of the same blood, from the same branch, holding simultaneously the same claim to the same title, each with an army at his back and no institutional authority between them capable of deciding which one was right. Kublai Khan was in southern China when Monk died, conducting the campaign against the Song. Erik Bok was at Karakorum, the imperial capital, in administrative charge of the Mongolian heartland. Each brother had a claim. Each brother had support. Each brother moved immediately. Erik Bok convened a Kurultai at Karakorum in 1260 with the support of the traditionalist Mongol faction, the men who wanted the empire to remain rooted in the steppe, to maintain its nomadic character, to govern China and Persia as sources of tribute rather than as civilizations worth engaging with on their own terms. Kublai convened his own Kurultai in northern China, with the support of the princes and commanders who had spent their careers governing sedentary populations and who understood that an empire the size of what the Mongols had built could not be administered from a gur on the grasslands. There were now two great Khans. The empire that Genghis Khan had built specifically to prevent the fragmentation of power had fragmented at its apex, at the precise level where fragmentation was most dangerous. Kublai cut off Erik Bok's supply lines to the agricultural south. Erik Bok held the symbolic capital and the support of the steppe heartland. The two men who shared a grandfather, a childhood, a blood oath to the same lineage, and an identical claim to the same throne fought each other for 4 years. The machine that had destroyed Kievan Rus, sacked Samarkand, and stood on the banks of the Danube was consuming itself. The civil war between Kublai and Erik Bok was not merely a family quarrel scaled up. It was, at its deepest level, a conflict about what the Mongol Empire fundamentally was. Erik Bok represented the original logic of the system: nomadic, mobile, extractive, rooted in the steppe and in the pastoral traditions that had produced the machine in the first place. Kublai represented the adaptation that governance of sedentary populations required: fixed administration, Chinese bureaucracy, the willingness to become, in some meaningful sense, part of the civilizations that had been conquered rather than merely above them. Neither position was wrong in its own terms. They were simply incompatible, and the system Genghis Khan had built contained no mechanism for resolving the incompatibility except force. Kublai won. Erik Bok surrendered in 1264 and died 2 years later, probably from illness, though the circumstances were ambiguous enough that posterity has always wondered. Kublai Khan was now the undisputed Great Khan. He proceeded to make himself exactly what Erik Bok had feared he would become: a Chinese emperor who happened to be Mongolian, ruling a dynasty he called the Yuan from a capital he built at what is now Beijing, governing through a Chinese bureaucratic apparatus, wearing Chinese court dress, conducting Chinese ceremonial. The steppe was a long way away. Karakorum, the capital Ögedei, had built as the fixed heart of the nomadic empire, eventually emptied out. The machine had found a new configuration. It was not recognizably the machine that Genghis Khan had designed. When Kublai convened his Kurultai to confirm his status as Great Khan after the Civil War, none of the 3 other Khanates sent representatives to recognize the result. Berk of the Golden Horde and Hulagu of the Ilkhanate were already fighting each other in the Caucasus, the first open war between Mongol Khanates, conducted with the same efficiency and brutality that had previously been reserved for external enemies. The Chagatai Khanate acknowledged no authority from Kublai. The Ögedei line, dispossessed under Monk and humiliated through the Civil War, was already organizing its own resistance under a prince named Kaidu, who would wage a 30-year insurgency against Kublai's authority in Central Asia. The empire was not fragmenting. It had fragmented. What remained was a collection of sovereign states that shared a lineage and a common origin, and very little else. What the succession wars demonstrate, examined as a system rather than as a sequence of personal conflicts, is that the fault lines identified in Section 5 operated with a kind of mechanical inevitability that personal virtue or personal failure could delay but not prevent. Ögedei was capable and was still followed by a 5-year interregnum. Monk was capable and was still followed by a civil war. The problem was not the men. The problem was the architecture. Every succession in the empire required a kurultai. Every kurultai was an arena for competing claims from branches whose interests had been diverging since the appanage system distributed the world among them. Every election produced a winner and a set of losers whose grievances became the fuel for the next crisis. The system reproduced its own instability at every transition with perfect structural regularity. Genghis Khan had built a machine so optimized for conquest that it could not generate, from its own internal logic, the succession mechanism that would have let it survive in peace. The meritocracy that had replaced the tribal aristocracy had not extended to the question of who led the empire. That question remained dynastic, contested, and ultimately irresolvable without violence. The man who had spent his life eliminating the structural failure modes of the old steppe order had embedded a new one at the very top of the system he built to replace it. The bundle of twigs he had asked his sons to hold together was now scattered across a continent, and each twig was burning on its own. By 1264, the Mongol Empire had ceased to exist as a unified political entity. What replaced it were four sovereign states that shared a founding lineage, a common military tradition, and almost nothing else. The Yuan dynasty in China, the Ilkhanate in Persia and the Middle East, the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, and the Golden Horde in the western steppes in Russia, each occupied a different ecological zone, governed a different population, faced different external pressures, and arrived at different answers to the same fundamental problem. How does a nomadic military aristocracy govern a sedentary civilization it has conquered but cannot become? The question was the same in all four cases. The answers were different. The failures were identical in their structure and instructive in their variety. The Yuan dynasty was Kublai Khan's answer, and it was the most ambitious attempt any of the four Khanates made to solve the governance problem. Kublai did not merely rule China from horseback. He moved the imperial capital to Khanbaliq, the city that would eventually become Beijing, adopted the formal apparatus of a Chinese dynasty, conducted Chinese court ceremonies, wore Chinese court dress, and renamed his realm the Yuan, placing himself in the lineage of Chinese imperial succession. He appointed Chinese and foreign administrators to the bureaucracy, conducted censuses, standardized taxation, and engaged with the Confucian intellectual tradition that had organized Chinese governance for centuries. He built, in some meaningful sense, a Chinese state under Mongol management. The limitations of this project were visible almost immediately, and they deepened after Kublai's death. The Mongols in China never fully assimilated into the Chinese administrative and cultural system. They maintained a separate identity, a separate legal status, in fact, under which Mongols and their Central Asian allies occupied the upper tiers of the imperial hierarchy, while the Han Chinese majority occupied the lower ones. This separation, intended to preserve Mongol distinctiveness within the Chinese state, produced precisely the dynamic that made Mongol rule in China unsustainable. A ruling minority that was neither Chinese enough to be accepted as legitimate by the population it governed, nor Mongol enough to maintain the military culture that had made its conquest possible. The Yuan dynasty fell in 1368 when Han Chinese rebel leader named Zhu Yuanzhang drove the last Yuan emperor north across the Gobi and founded the Ming dynasty. It had lasted less than a century. The Ilkhanate in Persia confronted the governance problem from a different angle. Hulagu Khan, who had led the Western campaign of 1256 through 1260, destroying the assassin strongholds in the Alborz Mountains, sacking Baghdad, and ending the Abbasid Caliphate that had governed Sunni Islam for 5 centuries, ruled over a predominantly Muslim population in a land with one of the richest administrative traditions in the world. Persian bureaucratic culture had survived the Achaemenid kings, Greek conquerors, Parthian rulers, Sasanian emperors, and Arab caliphs. It was not going to be dismantled by Mongols who had no replacement for it. Hulagu employed Persian administrators, conducted business through Persian intermediaries, and found himself governing in the idiom of the civilization he had arrived to subjugate. The religious politics of the Ilkhanate were its most volatile feature. Hulagu himself inclined toward Nestorian Christianity. His principal wife was a Christian, and his tolerance for Christian communities in Persia made him briefly popular among Eastern Christians who hoped the Mongols might become allies against the Islamic world. His destruction of Baghdad and the murder of the last Abbasid caliph had generated an implacable enmity with the Mamluk Sultanate of Egypt, which became the Ilkhanate's most dangerous neighbor and the only power that consistently defeated its armies. The Ilkhanate spent decades attempting and failing to form a military alliance with European Christian kingdoms against the Mamluks, a diplomatic project that produced cordial letters, occasional embassies, and no actual cooperation. European kings were not prepared to trust the people who had destroyed Kievan Rus and stood on the banks of the Danube. Ghazan Khan's conversion to Islam in 1295 was the Ilkhanate's most consequential political act and its clearest admission of the governance problem's terms. Three of Hulagu's successors had already flirted with Islam before Ghazan formalized the conversion as state policy. Ghazan adopted Islam, declared it the religion of the Khanate, reformed the tax system that had been extracting his Persian subjects into poverty, and began what amounted to a genuine attempt to legitimize Ilkhanate rule within the framework of the Islamic political tradition rather than above it. The attempt worked partially. Ghazan's reign was the most stable the Ilkhanate ever achieved. But the fiscal damage from decades of extraction was not reversible in a single competent reign. When Ghazan's successor died without an heir in 1335, the Ilkhanate dissolved into civil war and never re-emerged as a unified state. The Chagatai Khanate occupied the heartland of the Mongol world, the Central Asian steppe, and the great oasis cities of the Silk Road, and it was, in many respects, the Khanate that most resembled the empire Genghis Khan had built: mobile, contentious, internally divided, and resistant to the administrative consolidation that would have made it durable. Chagatai himself had been among the most conservative of Genghis Khan's sons, rigidly committed to the Yasa, hostile to the adaptations that governance of sedentary populations required, and deeply invested in maintaining the nomadic identity that had made the Mongols what they were. The Khanate that bore his name inherited his conservatism and expressed it through relentless internal conflict. The Chagatai Khanate never achieved anything approaching stable governance. Its rulers fought each other for dominance with exhausting regularity. The sedentary populations of the oasis cities, Samarkand, Bokhara, Kashgar, were taxed, disrupted, and periodically destroyed by campaigns that had more to do with dynastic competition between Chinggisid princes than with any coherent governing strategy. Attempts to convert the Khanate to Islam and stabilize its relationship with the urban populations it ostensibly ruled were repeatedly reversed by counter-coups from the nomadic steppe faction that preferred extraction to governance. The Khanate split into two halves in the mid-14th century and had effectively ceased to function as a unified political entity by 1363, when it fragmented entirely. Timur, the great conqueror of the late 14th century, rose from the wreckage of Chagatai's domain and built his own empire on what remained, claiming Chinggisid legitimacy through marriage rather than descent, since the Chinggisid lineage itself had been too thoroughly discredited by its own internal warfare to serve as a governing principle. The Golden Horde in the Western Steppe in Russia was the Khanate that came closest to finding a sustainable operating mode, and it did so by solving the governance problem in the most pragmatic way available. It largely declined to govern the territories it nominally controlled. The Russian principalities paid tribute to the horde, provided soldiers when demanded, and were required to obtain a patent of authority from the Khan before exercising local power. In exchange, the horde left the Russian administrative, religious, and social structures almost entirely intact. The Orthodox Church was given the same tax exemptions that Genghis Khan's Yasa had extended to all religious institutions. Russian princes competed for Mongol favor, traveled to Sarai to pay court, and maintained the horde's authority by acting as its intermediaries with a population the horde had no capacity to administer directly. This arrangement was, in its way, a shrewd adaptation of the original Mongol extractive model to conditions that made direct rule impossible. The horde's Mongol elite was too small to garrison the vast Russian territories it claimed. It had no administrative apparatus capable of replacing the Russian one. So it kept the Russian one, taxed its outputs, and used Mongol military power as the implied threat that kept the tribute flowing. For over a century, the system worked. The Golden Horde was the longest-lasting of the four Khanates, surviving in various forms into the 15th century, and the Russian political tradition, the centralized, authoritarian state structure that would eventually become characteristic of Moscow and its successors, was shaped in significant ways by a century of operating within the Horde's tributary framework. The conversion of the Golden Horde to Islam followed a trajectory that illustrated the governance problem's deepest logic. Berk Khan, Badu's younger brother who succeeded to the Horde's leadership in 1257, was the first Mongol ruler of any Khanate to embrace Islam, personally rather than as state policy, and with a genuine conviction that immediately created conflict with his cousin Hulagu's pro-Christian Ilkhanate. Berk fought Hulagu over Hulagu's destruction of Baghdad and the murder of the Caliph, becoming the first instance of one Mongol Khanate waging war against another on explicitly religious grounds. The machine had not merely stopped fighting external enemies. It had found religious motivation for fighting itself. Özbeg Khan, who took power in the Golden Horde in 1313, formalized Islam as the Khanate state religion and imposed conversion on the Mongol nobility with sufficient force that those who refused were eliminated. The Uzbek people take their name from him. Under Özbeg, the Horde reached the height of its power and territorial extent, the longest stable reign any Khan of the Horde ever achieved. The pattern was consistent across all three Western Khanates that converted. The adoption of the religion of the governed population stabilized the Khanate, generated the legitimacy that Mongol identity alone could not provide, and extended the state's lifespan. The Mongol rulers who survived longest were the ones who ceased to be Mongol in any meaningful sense. This was the revelation that lay at the heart of the Khanate system. It was a revelation that the system's founder had not anticipated, or perhaps had anticipated and had no answer for. The Yasa's religious tolerance had been a governing tool, a mechanism for reducing the friction of conquest. What it had not been was a framework for the Mongols' own religious and cultural identity in a world where the conquered populations vastly outnumbered the conquerors. In China, the Mongols became a minority Chinese dynasty. In Persia, they became Muslim Persian rulers. In the Western Steppe, they became Muslim Turco-Mongol rulers of a Turkicized Khanate. The specific Mongol identity, the steppe nomadism, the Tigris spirituality, the mobile pastoral culture, was eroded not by defeat but by the simple arithmetic of governing millions of people who were not Mongol. The irony was complete. Genghis Khan had built a system specifically designed to survive his death by eliminating the personal loyalty dependency of the old tribal confederations. He had replaced tribal identity with institutional loyalty to the decimal unit, to the Yasa, to the Chinggisid lineage. But the one thing the system could not survive was its own success. The more territory the machine conquered, the more the Mongols who governed it were absorbed into the populations they ruled. The Yasa's religious tolerance made assimilation easy. The absence of a strong Mongol cultural and administrative identity, the machine had been designed for war, not for cultural reproduction, made assimilation inevitable. 3 of the 4 Khanates were Muslim by the mid-14th century. None of them were recognizably Mongol. The Ilkhanate was gone by 1353. The Yuan dynasty fell in 1368. The Chagatai Khanate fragmented in 1363. The Golden Horde survived longer, but entered its own terminal decline after the Black Death devastated its population in the mid-14th century, and Timur's campaign shattered its military power at the end of the century. What had been the largest empire in history was, within a century and a half of its peak, a set of regional successor states whose Mongol identity was largely nominal, each governed by rulers who prayed in Arabic, administered in Persian or Chinese, and understood their authority in the religious and institutional terms of the civilizations they had once arrived to conquer. The machine had eaten itself, as the argument of this story predicted it would. But the mechanism of consumption was not, in the end, primarily military defeat or administrative incompetence or the inevitable overextension of a system too large to govern. The mechanism was simpler and stranger than that. The machine had been optimized so completely for conquest that it had no program for what conquest ultimately required, which was becoming, in some lasting sense, part of what you had taken. The Khanates that lasted longest were the ones that understood this earliest. The ones that resisted it longest fell first. Every Khanate that survived did so by ceasing to be the thing that had made it powerful, which was perhaps the most eloquent expression of the original design flaw that the story of the Mongol Empire has to offer. Every system has a design envelope, the range of conditions within which it functions is intended, and beyond which its performance degrades in specific and predictable ways. The Mongol military machine's design envelope was extraordinarily wide. It operated effectively across steppe, desert, mountain, and cultivated plain. It adapted to siege warfare, to riverine operations, to multi-front coordination across thousands of miles. It absorbed the technologies of every enemy it defeated. For half a century, every time the machine encountered a new condition it had not previously faced, it found a way to operate within it. The failures, when they came, were not random. They were diagnostic. Each one revealed a specific boundary of the machine's operating parameters, and together they constitute a map of what the system Genghis Khan built could not do. Japan presented the machine with a problem it had never encountered before and had no existing solution for: open water. The armies that had swept from the Pacific coast of China to the Danube were cavalry armies, fast, mobile, coordinated across vast distances, dependent on grass for their horses, and on the open terrain that made their speed and their archery devastating. The Korea Strait, the narrow body of water separating the Korean peninsula from the Japanese archipelago, was not an obstacle the machine could ride around. It required ships, and ships required a naval tradition, a shipbuilding industry, and a fighting doctrine that the Mongols did not possess and had to borrow from the Korean and Chinese populations they had subjugated. Kublai Khan launched the first invasion of Japan in 1274 with a fleet of perhaps 900 vessels carrying 30,000 to 40,000 men, mostly Korean and Chinese soldiers, with Mongol officers commanding. The fleet reached Hakata Bay on the island of Kyushu, established a beachhead, and encountered something unexpected: Japanese samurai who fought with a ferocity and individual martial skill that the Mongols' mass formation tactics were not optimized to counter. The Japanese style of combat, individual challenges, single combat between named warriors, was irrelevant against Mongol formations, but the samurai adapted faster than expected, and the invasion was halted on the beach by fierce resistance. Then a typhoon struck the fleet at anchor. Roughly a third of the ships sank. The force withdrew. 7 years later, in 1281, Kublai launched the second invasion, this time with one of the largest armadas the medieval world had ever assembled: 4,400 vessels. Estimates of the fighting force range from 70,000 to 140,000 men. Two separate fleets departing from Korea and from southern China, converging off Kyushu in August. In the intervening years, the Japanese had built coastal walls and adopted new tactics. The Mongol fleet, unable to find suitable landing beaches, was forced to stay offshore for weeks, the men remaining on the ships in summer heat. Then a massive typhoon struck. It was not the kind of storm that damaged a fleet. It was the kind that destroyed one. The vessels that had been lashed together for protection against Japanese night raids were shattered against each other and the coastline. Somewhere between half and two-thirds of the force drowned. The survivors who reached the beaches were killed. Kublai Khan's plan to add Japan to the Yuan Empire ended in the waters off Kyushu, and he never attempted a third invasion. The Japanese called the storms kamikaze, divine wind, and understood them as supernatural protection. What they were structurally was a revelation of the machine's deepest vulnerability. It had been built for land. Its naval capacity was entirely borrowed from populations that had been conquered rather than persuaded, and who built ships to the specifications of their conquerors rather than to the standards that oceanic campaigning required. The machine could cross the Korea Strait on a borrowed fleet in calm conditions. It could not sustain a naval campaign against a defended coastline with a borrowed fleet in a typhoon season. The water was not merely a geographic obstacle. It was a domain in which the machine's borrowed components failed under the specific stress conditions that domain imposed. Vietnam revealed a different boundary. Three times between 1258 and 1288, Mongol armies invaded the territory that is now northern Vietnam, and three times they were ultimately driven out. The first invasion succeeded in capturing the Vietnamese capital of Tang Long, but could not hold it. The Vietnamese court withdrew, the army dispersed into the jungle and the river deltas, and the Mongols found themselves occupying a city in a country that had effectively ceased to present a target. The machine required an enemy that would stand and fight in conditions where Mongol cavalry and firepower were decisive. The Vietnamese did not stand and fight. They retreated, harassed supply lines, cut off foraging parties, and waited for the climate to do what their army alone could not. The tropical heat and humidity of Southeast Asia degraded the machine's primary weapon, the horse. Mongol horses, bred for the cold, dry steppe, sickened and died in the lowland heat and the riverine terrain. Fodder was unavailable or insufficient. The cavalry that had made the army invincible on the open steppe became a logistical burden in the jungle. Disease spread through the ranks in ways that the army's operational planning had no protocol for managing. Supply lines that worked across thousands of miles of steppe, the AM network, the requisition provisions, the disciplined management of resources had no equivalent in the dense, wet, geographically complex terrain of the Vietnamese highlands and river systems. In 1285, after initial successes, a Mongol army of reportedly 500,000 men was driven from Vietnamese territory by a force it consistently outnumbered. In 1288, the Mongol fleet was lured into the Bac Dang River, trapped on hidden stakes as the tide fell, and destroyed. Vietnam submitted to nominal tributary status, which is to say, the Mongols accepted a formula that allowed them to claim victory while withdrawing entirely. Egypt and the Mamluk Sultanate presented the third diagnostic failure, and it was the most structurally significant of all. By the summer of 1260, Hulagu Khan's campaign through the Middle East had destroyed the assassin strongholds in Persia, sacked Baghdad and ended the Abbasid Caliphate, captured Damascus, and stood at the frontier of Egypt. The entire Islamic world west of the Euphrates lay open. Then Monk Khan died in China, and Hulagu withdrew the bulk of his force to attend the succession. He left approximately 10,000 men, a single Tumon, already reduced from full strength, under his general Kitbuka to hold the gains, 10,000 men to garrison Syria, Palestine, and the eastern approaches to Egypt. The Mamluk Sultanate of Egypt had its own particular relevance to this moment. The Mamluks were a military slave caste, recruited as children from the Eurasian steppe and trained from youth in the same traditions of horse archery and mobile warfare that had made the Mongols unstoppable. When the Mamluk army under Sultan Qutuz and his commander Baybars marched out of Cairo to meet Kitbuka's 10,000, they were not facing the Mongol machine with the conventional armies of settled civilization that the machine had been designed to destroy. They were facing men who had grown up on the same steppe, ridden the same horses, learned the same tactical vocabulary. They knew the feigned retreat. They knew the encirclement. They used both at the Battle of Ain Jalut on the 3rd of September 1260, and Kitbuka's force was defeated in open field, the first time in the empire's history that a Mongol army had been beaten in pitched battle by any force anywhere. The significance of Ain Jalut was not primarily military. Kitbuka's 10,000 were not the Mongol Empire in full strength. A reunified Mongol force under Hulagu's personal command, not distracted by civil war, would probably have produced a different result. The significance was administrative and structural. The machine had failed to hold what it had taken because it could not sustain a Western force in strength while simultaneously managing a succession crisis in the East. The civil war between Kublai and Erekbok had made it impossible to direct imperial resources toward the completion of the Western campaign. The appanage system, which had divided the empire's military capacity among competing branches, had ensured that no single commander could draw on the full weight of the empire's resources for any single campaign. The machine's external failure at Ain Jalut was the direct consequence of its internal structural failure, the same failure that Section 5 identified, expressing itself on a battlefield in Galilee. The Mongol failure to conquer India told a complementary story. Genghis Khan had pursued the Khwarezmian prince Jalal al-Din to the banks of the Indus in 1221, where the prince made a famous last stand before escaping into the Punjab. Genghis Khan reached the Indus, looked across it, and turned back. The reasons are debated: the summer heat, the unfamiliar terrain, the logistical impossibility of sustaining a campaign in the subcontinent without the infrastructure that the Indus Valley could not easily provide. Whatever the specific calculation, the pattern held. India represented a set of conditions: tropical heat, monsoon season, dense population, formidable sultanates, for which the machine as designed was not optimized, and every subsequent Mongol incursion into the subcontinent was repulsed or withdrew voluntarily before achieving its objectives. The Delhi Sultanate specifically proved capable of fielding war elephants and cavalry forces that neutralized the Mongol horse archers' primary advantages, and of retreating into the heat and the pre-monsoon season in ways that turned the climate itself into a defensive weapon. What the failed campaigns share, examined across their geographic variety, is a common underlying pattern. The machine failed whenever the specific conditions that made it effective were absent. The open steppe gave Mongol cavalry its speed, its range, and its decisive advantages in archery and maneuver. Remove the open steppe, replace it with jungle, ocean, river delta, or the logistical paralysis of civil war, and the machine's performance degraded in proportion. The feigned retreat that had broken the Rus army at the Kalkar River required open ground for the pursuit to develop over miles. The coordinated multi-column assault that had destroyed the Khwarezmian Empire required the ability to maintain communication and supply across vast distances. Japan required ships. Vietnam required a supply chain that could function in tropical conditions. Egypt, in 1260, required a full army rather than a depleted rearguard. The deeper implication of the failed campaigns was the one that the machine's designers had not built a solution for. Sustained occupation of distant territory required administrative capacity that the Mongol system did not generate from its own internal logic. The campaigns that succeeded left behind tribute collectors and garrison commanders and, eventually, adapted administrative systems borrowed from the conquered. The campaigns that failed left behind nothing, because there was nothing to leave: no administrative apparatus, no settled population of Mongol governors, no institutional framework for converting military victory into durable control. The machine could conquer. It had limited capacity to hold what it conquered against sustained resistance in conditions it had not been designed to operate in. Genghis Khan had designed machine optimized for one purpose. The campaigns that fell outside that purpose, Japan's open water, Vietnam's jungle and climate, Egypt's understrength garrison abandoned by a civil war, were not failures of the machine's design. They were expressions of it. A machine optimized for a specific purpose has specific limits. The Mongol Empire had reached all of them within a generation of its founder's death, and the limits were not geographic frontiers marked on a map. They were the edges of the design envelope, visible only when the machine was pushed beyond the conditions it had been built to exploit. Within those conditions, it had been and remained without peer. Outside them, it was just another army a long way from home. The Mongol Empire at its height was the largest contiguous land empire in human history. By the mid-14th century, it had dissolved into a set of successor states that barely acknowledged each other's authority, were fighting each other over borders and religion, and were being consumed from within by the same structural problems that had undone the original. The machine was gone. What remained was something stranger and more lasting than the machine itself: the world it had made, which was in several important respects a different world from the one it had found. The Pax Mongolica, a period of relative stability across Eurasian trade routes that coincided with the empire's peak between roughly 1240 and 1240, stretching through the period of the Khanates, was not a deliberate policy of peace in any conventional sense. The Mongols had no pacifist philosophy. The stability they imposed was the stability of overwhelming force. Merchants could travel safely from China to the Mediterranean because the empire controlled every transit point along the route, and the consequences of attacking a Mongol-protected caravan were known to everyone who had watched what happened to cities that resisted. Safety and terror were the same thing, applied from different directions. Within that enforced stability, trade moved on a scale that the pre-Mongol world had not sustained. Silk, porcelain, spices, and paper moved west from China. Silver, fine textiles, and glassware moved east from Europe. Technologies that had been confined to one civilization for centuries crossed the continent in both directions. Gunpowder, which Chinese engineers had been developing for military purposes since the 9th century, reached the Islamic world and eventually Europe through the Mongol period's trade flows. The printing press that Gutenberg developed in the 15th century drew on paper-making technology that had also made its westward journey along Mongol-secured routes. The connections the empire forced into existence outlasted the empire by centuries. Marco Polo's journey from Venice to the court of Kublai Khan in the 1270s was made possible by the Pax Mongolica, by the Yam relay network, by the Pesa of safe conduct that the Khan issued to travelers, by the administrative coherence that made a foreign merchant's passage across 10,000 miles of the world's most inhospitable terrain a matter of bureaucratic procedure rather than perpetual mortal risk. Polo returned to the counts of China that European readers initially dismissed as fantasy, cities of such enormous scale, such administrative sophistication, such material wealth that the descriptions seemed impossible. They were not impossible. They were descriptions of a world that European civilization had had almost no previous access to, made accessible for a few decades by the most violent empire the world had ever seen. The Mongols also moved people. Not merely as refugees, though the scale of displacement caused by the campaigns was enormous. The population of China fell from roughly 120 million to approximately 60 million during the Mongol conquest, a demographic collapse without precedent in the written record of any civilization. They moved skilled workers deliberately. Artisans, engineers, administrators, physicians, astronomers, and craftspeople were removed from conquered cities and relocated to wherever the empire needed their skills, creating communities of technical expertise far from their places of origin. A Parisian goldsmith named Guillaume Boucher was found working in Karakorum in the 1250s by the Franciscan friar William of Rubruck, who had traveled there as a papal envoy. He had been taken in the Mongol campaign through Hungary and carried east. He was working in the heart of Central Asia, making silver fountains for the Great Khan. The Chinggisid legitimacy, the principle that only a descendant of Genghis Khan through his sons by Borte could claim supreme authority, persisted as a political currency long after the Chinggisid states themselves had ceased to function. Rulers who lacked Chinggisid descent found it necessary to marry into the lineage, to rule through nominal Chinggisid figureheads, or to claim Chinggisid ancestry through genealogies that historians have noted with varying degrees of charity. Timur, the conqueror who rose from the ruins of the Ögedei Khanate in the late 14th century and built an empire comparable in geographic scope to the one he drew his model from, was not himself Chinggisid. He ruled through Chinggisid puppets for much of his career and married a Chinggisid princess to acquire a legitimating connection to the lineage. The name of Genghis Khan remained, for over 2 centuries after his death, the most powerful political credential in the known world. The Russian state that emerged from the shadow of the Golden Horde carried the Horde's administrative imprint in ways that shaped Russian political development for centuries. The centralized autocratic authority of the Muscovite state, the concentration of power in a single ruler, the subordination of the nobility to that ruler's personal will, the use of the state apparatus as an instrument of that will rather than as an independent institution with its own traditions and constraints, reflected a century of operating within a political system where ultimate authority resided in a distant Khan whose power was absolute and whose intermediaries governed by delegation rather than by right. The Mongol model of governance did not disappear when the Horde did. It became, in modified form, the template for the political culture that built the Russian Empire. The Black Death was the Pax Mongolica's most consequential unintended output. It was also the clearest demonstration of the empire's systemic logic applied to a domain its builders had never considered. The plague originated in the rodent populations of Central Asia, the region at the heart of the Chinggisid world, where the Ögedei Khanate's territory sat at the crossroads of the Silk Road routes. The infrastructure that the Mongols had built to move goods, soldiers, and messages at unprecedented speed across Eurasia was also, without any deliberate intention, the most efficient disease transmission network the world had ever possessed. The yam relay stations that allowed a message to travel 200 miles a day were also nodes where animals, merchants, and soldiers gathered from across the continent. The trade routes that made a Venetian merchant's journey to China possible also made a pathogen's journey from Central Asian marmots to Mediterranean ports possible in a matter of years rather than decades. The Black Death reached the Crimea in 1346, almost certainly carried along the trade routes of the Golden Horde's territory from its origin in Central Asia. The Mongol siege of the Genoese port of Kaffa in the same year brought the plague into direct contact with the European commercial population for the first time. Genoese ships fleeing Kaffa carried it to Constantinople, to Sicily, to Genoa itself. By 1351, it had killed somewhere between a third and a half of Europe's total population, an estimated 75 to 200 million people across Eurasia and North Africa. More died of the Black Death than died in all the Mongol conquests combined. The empire that had restructured Eurasia by force was also, in its final decades of coherence and its aftermath, restructuring it by disease, at a scale, and in a way that no one inside or outside the empire had anticipated or could have controlled. The plague devastated the Golden Horde as thoroughly as it devastated Europe. The mass death of the ruling elite and the administrative class triggered a period of internal conflict, the Zamiatna, the Great Troubles, that began in 1359 and ran for 2 decades, as rival claimants fought over a throne whose occupants were dying faster than the succession could settle. The Horde's authority over its Russian tributaries collapsed in direct proportion to its internal coherence. Moscow, which had been a minor principality, elevated to prominence specifically because its princes had been the most effective collectors of Mongol tribute, now found itself able to expand at the Horde's expense. The political order that the Mongols had imposed on Russia for a century and a half began to dissolve, not through Russian military victory, but through the Horde's self-consumption. The Mongol Empire's relationship to the question of what it was is the deepest puzzle its history poses. It was not, by conventional definitions, a state. It had no fixed capital for most of its existence, no stable bureaucracy, no institutional framework independent of the personal authority of the Khan. It was not a civilization in the sense of a shared cultural tradition transmitted across generations. The Mongols absorbed, adapted, and in many cases destroyed the civilizations they conquered, but they did not replace them with a Mongol civilization of comparable depth or durability. What the empire was, most precisely, was a system, an extraordinarily effective mechanism for the redistribution of power and resources across an enormous geographic area over a short period of time. Systems do not have legacies in the way that civilizations do. They have outputs. The Mongol Empire's outputs were the connected world of the Pax Mongolica, the Black Death, the Russian autocratic state, the political currency of Chinggisid legitimacy, and the demographic catastrophe of the conquest themselves. The question the empire forces every serious student to ask is whether those outputs were, in any meaningful sense, worth the cost. The conquests killed tens of millions of people by the most conservative estimates. Cities were eliminated, not just damaged, but erased, their populations gone, their libraries and institutions and accumulated knowledge destroyed. The irrigation systems of Central Asia, which had sustained agricultural civilizations for millennia, were wrecked in ways that required centuries to repair, and in some cases were never fully restored. The Abbasid Caliphate, which had been the organizational and intellectual heart of the Islamic world for 5 centuries, was extinguished in Baghdad in 1358, and the specific tradition of scholarship and governance it had sustained was permanently disrupted. The cost was not abstract. It was specific, measurable, and in some domains irreversible. Against that cost, the standard argument places the Pax Mongolica and the connections it generated. The trade flows of the 13th and early 14th centuries accelerated the exchange of knowledge, technology, and goods in ways that contributed to the conditions for the European Renaissance, the development of early modern science, and the eventual integration of the global economy. There is genuine historical substance to this argument. The technologies that came west during the Mongol period, gunpowder, printing, papermaking, the compass, were not trivial. The connections that made Marco Polo's journey possible were also the connections that eventually made Columbus's possible, as European geographical knowledge and commercial ambition expanded in direct response to what the Mongol period had revealed about the world's scale and richness. The machine that destroyed so much also, inadvertently, built the infrastructure of a more connected world. What the Mongol Empire ultimately teaches is not a lesson about good or evil, conquest or civilization, destruction or creation. It teaches a lesson about systems. Genghis Khan built a machine optimized for a single purpose with extraordinary precision and intelligence. The machine achieved that purpose at a scale no previous human institution had matched. And then the machine encountered the conditions that its design had not prepared it for: peacetime, succession, the governance of diversity, the passage of time, and it failed in ways that were structurally predictable from the design's own internal logic. The meritocracy that had replaced tribal aristocracy could not resolve succession without violence. The war economy that had replaced extraction could not sustain a sedentary population without conquest. The appanage system that had distributed rewards could not prevent fragmentation once the rewards stopped growing. Every feature of the design that had made it effective contained, in the same feature, the mechanism of its own eventual failure. A man was born on the banks of the Onon River around 1162, into a world that had been producing and destroying great steppe empires for 6 centuries. He spent his childhood in poverty and captivity and near extinction, watching the old system demonstrate its failure modes on his own family. He spent his adulthood designing a replacement, testing it in the most demanding condition imaginable, and watching it conquer more of the world than any previous human institution had ever held. He died in the field at war, which was the only place his machine had a mode for. His sons and grandsons held the machine together through will and violence and occasional genius for another generation, and then the machine, in the way of all machines designed for a single purpose, operated beyond their design envelope, with no maintenance protocol for the conditions they were not built for, consumed the empire it had created, and the world it had briefly unified fractured back into the pieces it had always wanted to be. The steppe is grass again. The jares are gone. The bundle is scattered. And the question Genghis Khan spent his life trying to answer, how do you build something that lasts, remains, as it was on the day he asked it, unanswered.